The Royal Navy had spent much of the early part of the interwar period building large submarines for various long-distance patrol duties, alongside various experimental submarines, also large, which made sense given an early focus on war in the Far East. But a number of factors in the mid to late 1920s began to change this. The big submarines were also quite expensive and took a long time to build, and there were limitations to how fast they could dive and maneuver. Moreover, in times of war, it would take quite some time to replenish losses. Finally, in the various arm control discussions in the run-up to the London Conference in 1930, there was an attempt by the British to regulate large submarines almost into non-existence, but, as with the Washington Treaty leaving a loophole for carriers under 10,000 tons and also not regulating small craft such as sloops, there was an exemption built into the British proposals where a submarine of 600 tons or less would not be regulated, these being classed as defensive subs as opposed to larger, longer-distance offensive subs. It was also thought that this would allow for the fast building of large numbers of otherwise unregulated submarines, which could also be ideal as training craft, which could then be used as patrol craft for harbour and port defence, or for operations in shallow and confined waters such as those found around Europe. Although the attempt to give themselves a loophole in the treaty went nowhere, the idea of having a small submarine persisted, not least because the wide variety of World War I era smaller subs were beginning to age out. The initial concept ended up being for a 700-ton submarine, since the 600-ton loophole didn't exist anymore. This would be capable of 12 knots on the surface and armed with 4 bow torpedo tubes. 3 designs were proposed, S1 through S3, ranging from about 700 tons to almost 800 tons, and thanks to newer diesels, they would have a surface speed of 14 knots, with 9 to 10 knots underwater depending on the design, and 4 to 6 torpedo tubes, again depending on the design, each with 1 reload on hand. After consulting with the commanders of the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets and paring down some of the overly ambitious requests, the initial decision was to go with design S3, which was the mid-size design of the pack, but had 6 tubes. Underwater speed would be about 10 knots, and the submarine would be fitted with ASDIC. Some attempts were made to cut the size down, but the imminence of a need to order the first submarines forestalled most of these efforts, and the first 2 subs were ordered for construction to begin in 1930. To improve underwater speed and endurance, the 3-inch deck gun was initially to be in a retractable mounting, although in the end the complexity of this meant that it didn't last in service, and later subs would be gradually transitioned over to a fixed gun. Weight-saving measures that were enacted included the elimination of power loading for the torpedoes in the name of increasing living space, and a reduction of the ballast keel, along with a simplification of the oil and water tank system. With a final surface displacement of 640 tons and about 940 when submerged, the first 4 S-class were built, followed by 8 more, almost all built in pairs, over the course of the 1930s, with the second group coming in at 670 tons on the surface and 960 submerged, thanks to various additional measures, including a stronger internal bulkhead set, escape airlocks, and a slightly more optimized hull form. All of this was propelled around by just under 1,600 brake horsepower of diesel engines and 1,300 horsepower of electric motors, which were driving a pair of screws. General submarine construction then moved on to the larger T-class, but with the advent of World War II, large numbers of submarines were needed, and it was judged that although more would be ordered, the T-class were probably too large for mass production in the numbers that were felt needed. The recently started U-class was seen as too small for some purposes, and so the S-class design was dusted off and quickly given a refresh, addressing issues that had been raised by the first submarines in service and improving capabilities generally. This resulted in a third group that displaced between 810 and 840 tons on the surface and nearly 1,000 tons submerged, depending on exactly when in the group the sub was built, and these subs were a little bit longer. The use of more powerful diesels upped the surface speed to 15 knots, which allowed for full power charging of the batteries while retaining an 11-knot surface speed, and a rear-firing external torpedo tube, obviously without a reload, was included. The pressure hull was also made somewhat stronger, and additional fuel for more endurance was included as well. 61 of these would be ordered over the course of the war, and midway through the run, the external aft torpedo tube was eliminated in favour of having a heavier deck gun, while additional anti-aircraft guns and radar would gradually be installed across the entire class. 50 of the 61 ordered would then be completed, which brought the total S-class build up to 62. Fighting in contested, close, shallow and confined waters, the class experienced significant losses early on, with 9 of the 12 original subs being lost, along with 9 of the emergency war-built craft. Post-war, a number of the submarines would go on to serve in the Portuguese, French and Israeli navies, with most of those that survived in British service, if they survived the late 1940s downsizing, being scrapped in the early to mid-1960s. The last survivor of the class was HMS Springer, which by now was going under the name INS Tanin, which fought in the Six-Day War under Israeli colours and was only scrapped in 1972.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.